Most people don't realize this, but if you're listening to this right now, there's a high chance you've been learning English for a very long time. 5 years, 10 years, maybe even longer. You've studied vocabulary lists, memorized grammar rules, passed exams, completed courses, downloaded apps, and watched countless videos. And yet, when it comes to actually speaking English, expressing your thoughts clearly, confidently, and naturally, you still feel stuck. This episode is not here to shame you. It's here to tell you the truth most people never hear. The reason you still can't speak English after 10 years has very little to do with intelligence, effort, or discipline. In fact, many of the people who struggle the most are intelligent, hard-working, and highly capable in other areas of life. The real issue is far deeper and far more uncomfortable to confront. You were never taught to speak English. You were taught to study English. And those two things are not the same. At school, English was presented as a subject, not as a living skill. You learned how to choose the correct answer, how to identify grammatical errors, how to translate sentences, and how to avoid being wrong. Over time, your brain was trained to analyze English, judge English, and evaluate English, but not to use it, not to think with it, not to live with it. So when you try to speak, your mind doesn't move forward naturally. It freezes, it hesitates, it checks, it doubts. You are not failing at English in that moment. You are simply doing exactly what your training taught you to do. Stop and analyze. This is the paradox that traps millions of adult learners. The more years they spend learning, the harder speaking becomes. Not because they know too little, but because they know too much in the wrong way. Here at Think and Speak English, we approach English differently. We don't start with grammar. We don't start with vocabulary lists. We start with the mind. Because language is not stored in books. It's stored in patterns, habits, and reflexes inside your brain. If you want to speak English, you must first understand how your thinking has been shaped by years of the wrong system. And once you see that clearly, something powerful happens. The frustration you've carried for years begins to make sense. The self-blame starts to dissolve. You realize that you were never broken. You were simply trained for the wrong outcome. This podcast exists for one reason: to help adult learners rebuild their relationship with English from the inside out, not by adding more information, but by upgrading the way you think. Because when you upgrade your mind, you naturally improve your English.
Welcome to Think and Speak English. From the very beginning, most people were introduced to English in a classroom, not in life. And that single detail changed everything. In school, English was never something you used to express who you were. It was something you studied in order to be evaluated. From the first lesson, your brain learned a clear rule. English is not for communication. English is for assessment. Every sentence came with a hidden question attached to it. Is this correct? Is this acceptable? Will this be marked wrong? Over time, that question became automatic. Instead of asking, "What do I want to say?" your mind learned to ask, "What is the correct structure here?" Instead of focusing on meaning, your attention was trained to hunt for mistakes. Grammar was not presented as a tool for clarity, but as a system of traps you had to avoid. Vocabulary was not something you used to describe real experiences, but something you memorized for the next test and quickly forgot after. This is how the brain was programmed. Years of this kind of learning created a specific mental habit. Whenever English appears, the brain switches into exam mode. It becomes cautious. It becomes defensive. It slows down. Not because you were weak, but because you were trained to survive an environment where being wrong had consequences. In that system, silence felt safer than speaking. Thinking felt safer than acting. Analysis felt safer than expression. And slowly, without anyone ever explaining it to you, English became associated with pressure, with judgment, with the fear of being exposed as not good enough. Even now, as an adult, that association remains. When you open your mouth to speak English, the same mental circuitry activates. Your brain is not trying to help you communicate, it is trying to protect you from making a mistake. This is why so many people say, "I understand English, but I can't speak it." Understanding was rewarded, speaking was risky. The education system did not fail because it taught grammar. It failed because it taught grammar in isolation, disconnected from human expression. It separated language from life. It taught rules without context, accuracy without flow, and correctness without purpose. As a result, your brain became very good at recognizing English, but very bad at producing it. And the longer you stayed in that system, the deeper that habit was reinforced. 10 years of studying did not build speaking ability, it built mental breaks. It trained you to pause, to double-check, to hesitate. So when real conversation happens, fast, unpredictable, imperfect, your brain does not know how to respond. It tries to apply exam logic to real life, and everything collapses. This is not a personal flaw. It is a predictable outcome of the way English has been taught to generations of learners. At Think and Speak English, we begin by undoing this conditioning, because before you can speak freely, you must first recognize the invisible rules that have been controlling your behavior for years. And once you see them clearly, you can finally let them go. After years of this kind of training, something strange begins to happen. The more English you learn, the harder it becomes to speak. Not because your knowledge is insufficient, but because your mind has been taught to slow itself down. Every new grammar rule adds another checkpoint. Every new exception adds another layer of doubt. What was once a simple attempt to express an idea turns into a complex internal process. Before a single word leaves your mouth, your brain starts running background checks. Is this the right tense? Is this sentence formal enough? Is there a better word? Is my pronunciation acceptable? This is not fluency. This is mental overload. Fluent speech does not come from conscious control. It comes from automatic response. Just like driving a car or typing on a keyboard, speaking requires patterns that operate below awareness. But when you have spent years being rewarded for thinking carefully and punished for being wrong, your brain refuses to let go of control. So, instead of allowing language to flow, your mind interrupts it. You hesitate not because you don't know what to say, but because you know too many possibilities, and each possibility competes for attention. The brain, faced with too many choices and too much risk, chooses the safest option: delay. This is why highly educated learners often struggle more than beginners. Beginners speak with fewer words, but they speak. They are not yet burdened by rules. Advanced learners, on the other hand, carry an entire textbook in their head and try to consult it in real time. But real conversation does not wait. When someone speaks to you, there is no pause button. The moment passes quickly, and if your brain is still analyzing, the opportunity to respond disappears. That delay is then interpreted as failure, which reinforces the belief that you are bad at speaking, even though the real problem is excessive thinking.
The irony is painful. The system that promised mastery through knowledge
ends up creating paralysis through overanalysis. Over time, your brain begins to associate speaking English with stress. It anticipates difficulty before it even begins. And anticipation alone is enough to slow down reaction time. What should be a spontaneous exchange turns into a high-pressure performance. At Think and Speak English, we treat this not as a language problem, but as a cognitive one. Speaking fluently is not about knowing more. It is about thinking less at the right moment. It is about retraining the brain to trust patterns instead of policing them. Until that shift happens, learning more will only add weight, and the heavier the mental load, the slower the response. That is why so many people reach a point where they say, "I keep studying, but I feel like I'm getting worse." In reality, they are not getting worse. They are simply trying to speak through a system that was never designed for speed, spontaneity, or real human interaction. One of the most dangerous misunderstandings in English learning is the belief that knowing English is the same as being able to use it. On the surface, they look similar. In reality, they are worlds apart. Many learners can recognize words, understand articles, follow videos, and even explain grammar rules to others. They can read an email and understand its meaning. They can listen to a conversation and know what is happening. And because of that, they assume speaking should come naturally. But when the moment arrives, when they need to respond, explain, or express themselves, the words don't come out. This is where frustration begins. Knowledge lives in the mind as information. Use lives in the body as action. And action requires repetition, exposure, and permission to be imperfect. Understanding alone does not create ability. It only creates potential. In most traditional learning systems, potential is mistaken for progress. As long as you can answer questions correctly, the system tells you that you are improving. But real life does not ask you to choose between A, B, C, or D. It asks you to speak, to react, to negotiate meaning in real time, and that requires a completely different kind of training. This is why many people feel confident when studying alone, but freeze in conversation. Alone, there is no pressure, no time limit, no human presence. You can pause, think, check, and correct yourself. But communication does not allow that luxury. Communication is dynamic. It is imperfect. It moves forward whether you are ready or not. When English stays in the realm of knowledge, it feels safe. When it becomes a tool for interaction, it becomes vulnerable. And most learners were never trained to handle that vulnerability. The system rewarded silent competence, not visible effort. It praised correct answers, not brave attempts. So over time, people learned to protect their identity as someone who knows English by avoiding situations where that identity could be challenged. But here's the uncomfortable truth. English that cannot be used creates no value. It does not open doors. It does not change careers. It does not deepen relationships. It stays locked inside the mind, impressive on paper, invisible in life. At Think and Speak English, we make this distinction very clear. Knowing is passive, using is active, and transformation only happens in action. The goal is not to sound perfect. The goal is to be understood. The goal is not to impress. The goal is to connect. When English becomes a tool instead of a subject, something shifts. The pressure decreases. The focus moves from correctness to clarity. And slowly, the language begins to serve you instead of controlling you. This is the moment where many learners realize something important. 10 years of studying did not fail them. It simply prepared them for the wrong test. And once that realization sets in, a new path becomes possible. One where English is no longer something you know, but something you can actually use. At this point, many learners begin to notice a pattern, even if they have never named it before. Every time they try to speak English, there is a delay. And inside that delay, something very specific is happening. Before a sentence is spoken, it's first formed in their native language. Then, almost automatically, the mind attempts to translate it into English. After that, the sentence is reviewed, adjusted, and mentally corrected, sometimes multiple times, before the speaker even considers opening their mouth. This internal translation loop feels responsible. It feels careful. It feels intelligent. But it is also one of the biggest obstacles to fluent speech. Translation is not communication. Translation is a cognitive task. It requires precision, comparison, and conscious effort. Conversation, on the other hand, is fast, emotional, and imperfect. When you force conversation to pass through translation, you slow it down to the speed of analysis. The brain was never designed to translate in real time under social pressure. That is why even learners with strong reading and listening skills often struggle to respond quickly in conversation. Their minds are busy converting meaning from one system into another, instead of simply expressing an idea. This process becomes even heavier as proficiency increases. As learners gain more vocabulary and grammar knowledge, the number of possible translations expands. The mind begins to hesitate not because it lacks options, but because it has too many. Each word choice feels risky. Each structure feels like a decision that must be justified. And while the brain is deciding, the moment passes. In real conversations, people don't wait for perfect sentences. They respond to intent, emotion, and timing. When a learner is stuck translating, they are no longer participating in the conversation. They are observing it from the outside.
Over time, this habit trains the brain to associate English with effort instead of flow. Speaking becomes mentally exhausting. Even short conversations feel draining, not because of lack of ability, but because every sentence requires conscious construction. At Think and Speak English, we identify this thinking loop as a thinking problem, not a language deficiency. Fluent speakers are not faster translators. They are people who no longer translate at all. They think in meaning, not in words, and they use familiar patterns to express that meaning directly. Until this shift happens, fluency will always feel just out of reach. Because no matter how much English you learn, if every sentence must pass through your native language first, speaking will always feel slower than thinking. When we listen to someone who speaks English fluently, it often feels effortless. The sentences are not perfect, but they move naturally. There are pauses, but those pauses feel intentional, not forced. Ideas flow from one to the next without visible struggle. And many learners assume that this fluency comes from having a large vocabulary or mastering complex grammar. In reality, the difference between fluent speakers and hesitant speakers has very little to do with how much they know. Fluent speakers do not build sentences word by word. They rely on familiar patterns, chunks of language that are already stored and ready to use. These patterns allow them to focus on meaning instead of structure. They are not thinking about how to form a sentence. They are thinking about what they want to communicate. Hesitant speakers, on the other hand, approach language as a construction project. Each sentence feels like something that must be assembled carefully, piece by piece. Even simple ideas require effort because nothing feels automatic. The mind is busy managing details instead of delivering messages. This difference changes everything. When you speak through patterns, your attention stays on the conversation. You can listen, react, and adjust naturally. When you speak through analysis, your attention turns inward. You become self-focused, constantly monitoring your performance. That self-monitoring interrupts flow and creates tension. Fluent speakers also accept imperfection. They understand, often unconsciously, that communication does not require precision at every moment. Meaning can survive small errors. Hesitant speakers, however, often believe that accuracy must come first. They wait for the right sentence, and in waiting, they lose the moment. Another key difference lies in emotional state. Fluent speakers are present. Hesitant speakers are cautious. Presence allows the brain to access stored language quickly. Caution forces the brain into evaluation mode, which slows everything down. This is why someone with fewer words can sound more natural than someone with advanced knowledge. Natural speech is not about complexity. It is about familiarity. It is about using what you know without fear. At Think and Speak English, we emphasize this distinction because it reframes the entire learning process. The goal is not to expand knowledge endlessly, but to deepen familiarity with a smaller set of usable patterns. Fluency grows from repetition, not accumulation. When learners understand this, a major shift occurs. They stop chasing more information and start training for automaticity. And as automaticity increases, hesitation fades, not because the language became easier, but because the thinking became simpler. There is a pattern that appears again and again among adult English learners, and it often surprises people when they first recognize it. Those who are intelligent, analytical, and highly capable in other areas of life are often the ones who struggle the most when it comes to speaking English. This is not a coincidence. Intelligent people are trained to think carefully. They are good at evaluating options, spotting weaknesses, and optimizing outcomes. These are powerful skills in most professional and academic environments, but in spoken language, those same strengths can quietly become obstacles. When intelligent learners speak English, their minds do not simply express an idea and move on. They evaluate the idea before it is spoken. They search for a better word. They reconsider the structure. They imagine how the sentence will sound to others. And while all of this is happening, the conversation continues without them. This constant self-evaluation creates friction. Each sentence becomes a decision-making process instead of a natural response. And the more capable the mind is at analysis, the more it tends to interfere. There is also a deeper psychological layer. Intelligent learners often tie their identity to competence. They're used to being good at things. They're used to being correct. Speaking a foreign language threatens that identity because it exposes imperfection in a very public way. As a result, the mind becomes protective. Protection shows up as silence, hesitation, or overthinking, not because the person lacks ability, but because the brain is trying to preserve self-image. In this state, speaking feels risky, mistakes feel personal, and the pressure to perform well blocks the ability to perform naturally. What should be a simple exchange turns into a test of intelligence, and the mind reacts by slowing down. Fluent speakers, by contrast, are often willing to sound simple. They allow themselves to be slightly imprecise. They value momentum over perfection. This does not mean they are less intelligent. It means they have learned when to stop thinking.
At Think and Speak English, we help learners recognize that fluency is not a reflection of intelligence. It is a reflection of trust. Trust in familiar patterns, trust in the listener, and most importantly, trust in the process of communication. Once intelligent learners understand that speaking is not a measure of their worth or capability, something changes. The mental tension releases. The need to impress fades, and with that release, language begins to flow. This is why the path to fluency often begins not with learning more, but with letting go. letting go of constant evaluation, letting go of the fear of being judged, and letting go of the belief that every sentence must prove something. When the mind steps back, the voice can finally step forward. There is a pattern that appears again and again among adult English learners, and it often surprises people when they first recognize it. Those who are intelligent, analytical, and highly capable in other areas of life are often the ones who struggle the most when it comes to speaking English. This is not a coincidence. Intelligent people are trained to think carefully. They are good at evaluating options, spotting weaknesses, and optimizing outcomes. These are powerful skills in most professional and academic environments, but in spoken language, those same strengths can quietly become obstacles. When intelligent learners speak English, their minds do not simply express an idea and move on. They evaluate the idea before it is spoken. They search for a better word. They reconsider the structure. They imagine how the sentence will sound to others. And while all of this is happening, the conversation continues without them. This constant self-evaluation creates friction. Each sentence becomes a decision-making process instead of a natural response. And the more capable the mind is at analysis, the more it tends to interfere. There is also a deeper psychological layer. Intelligent learners often tie their identity to competence. They're used to being good at things. They're used to being correct. Speaking a foreign language threatens that identity because it exposes imperfection in a very public way. As a result, the mind becomes protective. Protection shows up as silence, hesitation, or overthinking, not because the person lacks ability, but because the brain is trying to preserve self-image. In this state, speaking feels risky, mistakes feel personal, and the pressure to perform well blocks the ability to perform naturally. What should be a simple exchange turns into a test of intelligence, and the mind reacts by slowing down. Fluent speakers, by contrast, are often willing to sound simple. They allow themselves to be slightly imprecise. They value momentum over perfection. This does not mean they are less intelligent, it means they have learned when to stop thinking. At Think and Speak English, we help learners recognize that fluency is not a reflection of intelligence. It is a reflection of trust. Trust in familiar patterns, trust in the listener, and most importantly, trust in the process of communication.
Once intelligent learners understand that speaking is not a measure of their worth or capability, something changes. The mental tension releases. The need to impress fades. And with that release, language begins to flow. This is why the path to fluency often begins not with learning more, but with letting go. Letting go of constant evaluation, letting go of the fear of being judged, and letting go of the belief that every sentence must prove something. When the mind steps back, the voice can finally step forward. There is a hard truth that most English learners never stop to confront, and that truth is this: the majority of what they study will never be used. Not occasionally unused, not temporarily forgotten, simply never used at all. Learners spend years collecting advanced vocabulary, rare expressions, and complex grammatical structures, believing that more knowledge will eventually translate into better speaking. But real conversations do not reward complexity. They reward clarity. They reward speed. They reward familiarity. In everyday communication, people rely on a surprisingly small set of language patterns. They repeat the same structures again and again, adjusting only the details. The words change, but the framework stays the same. This is not because fluent speakers lack vocabulary, but because efficiency matters more than variety. Most learners, however, are trained to do the opposite. They are encouraged to constantly expand, more words, more rules, more exceptions.
The result is a growing gap between what they know and what they actually use. Knowledge accumulates, but usability does not. This creates a silent illusion of progress. Studying feels productive. Learning new material feels satisfying. But when it comes time to speak, the brain does not reach for what was learned, it reaches for what is familiar. And familiarity comes only from repeated use in real contexts. This is why someone who has studied English for 10 years may still rely on very basic sentences when speaking, not because they cannot do more, but because those basic sentences are the only ones that have been reinforced through use. The painful realization is that fluency is not built by expanding outward, but by going deeper. It is not about knowing 10 ways to say the same thing, but about owning one way so completely that it comes out without effort.
At Think and Speak English, we challenge the idea that more is better. Instead, we focus on what actually survives in real communication. We ask a different question, not how much English do you know, but how much English can you use without thinking? When learners shift their focus in this way, something unexpected happens. They stop feeling overwhelmed. They stop feeling behind. And they begin to notice that fluency is not as distant as they once believed. It was never hidden in advanced material. It was buried under too much information. The truth is uncomfortable, but freeing. You do not need most of what you have studied. And once you accept that, you can finally begin to build English that works, English that lives, moves, and responds when you need it. At some point, many learners reach a familiar conclusion. I just need to study more vocabulary, more grammar, another course, another method, another promise that this time things will finally change. Studying feels safe. It happens in private. It offers structure. It gives a sense of control. There are clear steps, clear materials, and no social risk. You can pause, repeat, and stay within your comfort zone. And because effort is being invested, it feels productive. But speaking is not built in that environment. Speaking requires exposure. It requires speed. It requires the willingness to produce imperfect language in real time. None of these conditions exist in traditional studying. So, while learning increases knowledge, it does not increase readiness. This is why learners often feel confident while studying, but unprepared when speaking. The skills are not the same. One is cognitive, the other is behavioral. Another reason studying feels appealing is that it postpones discomfort. As long as you are preparing, you do not have to face the vulnerability of real communication. You can tell yourself that you are not ready yet, that you just need one more level, one more resource, one more improvement. But fluency does not arrive after preparation. It is built during participation. The brain adapts to what it is repeatedly asked to do. If it is repeatedly asked to recognize information, it becomes good at recognition. If it is repeatedly asked to produce language under pressure, it becomes good at production. Studying alone trains recognition. Speaking trains response. At Think and Speak English, we see this pattern constantly. Learners who study intensely but rarely speak feel stuck. Learners who speak regularly, even with limited language, improve faster. Not because they are more talented, but because their training matches their goal. This does not mean studying is useless. It means studying without usage is incomplete. Knowledge must be activated. Language must be tested in motion. Until English is used as a tool, messy, imperfect, and real, it remains theoretical. And theory, no matter how advanced, does not prepare the brain for conversation. This is the moment where many learners need to shift their mindset. The question is no longer what should I study next, but how can I use what I already know today? Once that question becomes central, progress accelerates, not because the language changed, but because the direction changed. From the very beginning, most people are taught a simple rule: mistakes are bad. In school, being wrong carries consequences. Points are deducted, answers are marked incorrect, errors are highlighted in red. Over time, this creates a powerful association. Making mistakes means failing. That mindset works in certain academic settings, but when it comes to language, it becomes deeply destructive. Language is not a fixed system to be executed perfectly. It is a living process that evolves through trial, feedback, and adjustment. Mistakes are not signs of weakness. They are signals that learning is happening. Without them, the brain has no data to refine its responses. Yet most learners were trained to avoid errors at all costs. Speaking up without certainty felt dangerous. Silence felt safer. And gradually, the brain learned that not speaking was better than speaking incorrectly. This training does not disappear with age. Even as adults, the emotional response remains. When faced with the possibility of making a mistake in English, the body reacts. Tension rises, the voice tightens, the mind hesitates. The fear is no longer academic, it is psychological. The tragedy is that fluency requires the very thing learners have been conditioned to avoid. It requires experimentation. It requires repeated failure. It requires saying things that are incomplete, awkward, or slightly wrong. Children understand this instinctively. They speak before they are correct. They test sounds, patterns, and meanings without self-judgment. Their progress is rapid, not because they are smarter, but because they are free to be wrong. Adults, on the other hand, carry years of conditioning. They wait until a sentence feels safe, and because it rarely does, they speak less and less. The brain, receiving fewer opportunities to practice, weakens the very pathways needed for fluency. At Think and Speak English, we challenge this deeply rooted belief. We do not treat mistakes as problems to be eliminated, but as tools to be used. Each error reveals where adjustment is needed. Each imperfect sentence builds tolerance for uncertainty, and tolerance is what allows speech to flow. Until learners are willing to be wrong, they will never give their brains the experience required to be right. When people say that children learn languages faster than adults, they often assume it is because children's brains are more flexible. While there is some truth to that, the real difference lies elsewhere. The most important gap between children and adults in language learning is not cognitive, it is emotional. Children do not protect their identity when they speak. They are not trying to sound intelligent, competent, or impressive. They speak to express needs, curiosity, and emotion. If they are understood, the attempt is successful. If they are not, they try again. There is no self-judgment attached to the outcome. Adults, by contrast, bring their entire sense of self into the act of speaking. Language becomes a performance, not a tool. Every sentence feels like a reflection of intelligence, education, and social status. As a result, mistakes are no longer neutral, they feel personal. This emotional weight changes how the brain behaves. Instead of exploring language, adults monitor it. Instead of experimenting, they evaluate, and evaluation slows everything down. Children also live in a constant feedback loop. They speak, receive a response, adjust, and move on. Corrections happen naturally, often without explicit explanation. Adults rarely experience this kind of environment. Feedback feels like criticism. Correction feels like exposure. Because of this, adults often wait until they feel ready before speaking. But readiness never arrives. Language grows through use, not preparation. Children understand this intuitively. Adults forget it. Another key difference is memory. Children do not try to memorize language consciously. They absorb it through repetition and context. Adults, trained to study, attempt to memorize rules and vocabulary. Memorization creates knowledge, but not fluency. At Think and Speak English, we help adult learners reclaim what they lost. Not brain capacity, but permission. Permission to sound simple. Permission to repeat themselves. Permission to speak without fully understanding every rule. Once that permission is restored, progress accelerates. Adults do not need to become children again. They need to let go of the emotional barriers that prevent natural learning. The difference between a child and an adult learner is not ability, it is fear. And when fear is removed, the brain remembers how to learn. When speaking is avoided for long periods of time, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The brain does not remain neutral, it adapts. Language reflexes are built through use. Each time you speak, neural pathways are activated, reinforced, and refined. When those pathways are not used, they weaken. This is not a punishment, it is simply how the brain conserves energy. Silence over time becomes the default. At first, avoidance feels temporary. You tell yourself that you will speak later when you feel more confident, more prepared, more fluent. But later rarely comes. And as time passes, the distance between understanding and speaking grows wider. What was once hesitation becomes habit. The brain begins to associate English with inaction. It learns that when English appears, the safest response is to stay quiet. This response happens automatically, without conscious choice. By the time you notice it, the moment to speak has already passed. This creates a dangerous illusion. Because you can still understand English, you assume the ability to speak is intact. But speaking is not stored knowledge, it is a reflex. And reflexes decay without movement. Over time, this decay feels like a loss. Learners say, "I used to speak better than this," or "I know more than I can say." The frustration is real, but the explanation is simple. The brain has not been asked to perform the task, so it no longer does so efficiently. Avoidance also reinforces fear. Each missed opportunity becomes evidence that speaking is difficult. Each silence strengthens the belief that you are not ready. This belief then justifies further avoidance, creating a closed loop. At Think and Speak English, we emphasize breaking this loop early, not by forcing perfection, but by restoring motion. Even imperfect speech reactivates dormant pathways. Even simple sentences rebuild timing and confidence. Fluency does not disappear overnight, and it does not return overnight either, but it responds quickly to consistent use. Once the brain sees that speaking is safe, that mistakes are survivable, and communication is possible, it begins to recover. Silence feels protective, but it slowly erodes ability. Speech feels risky, but it rebuilds it. And the choice between the two determines whether English remains trapped in your head or becomes part of your voice. When you step back and look at all of this together, a clearer picture begins to emerge. The problem was never time, it was never effort, and it was never intelligence. It was alignment. For years, you were trained in a system that rewarded analysis over action, correctness over communication, and silence over risk. You learned English in a way that made sense for exams, but not for life. And because the system was consistent, the outcome was predictable. You learned to understand English. You learned to judge English, but you were never trained to live inside it. This is why so many learners feel a quiet sense of confusion. They did what they were told. They followed the rules, they studied seriously, and yet the result never matched the promise. The frustration that follows is often internalized as personal failure. But once you understand the deeper mechanics, that self-blame no longer holds. Fluency is not something that suddenly appears after enough preparation. It is not a reward for perfect knowledge. It is a byproduct of repeated, imperfect use. It grows when the brain is allowed to prioritize meaning over form, speed over certainty, and connection over correctness. This requires a shift, not in technique, but in identity. You must stop seeing yourself as a student waiting to be ready and start seeing yourself as a user who is already participating. You must stop asking whether your English is good enough and start asking whether your message is clear enough. Those two questions lead to very different behaviors. At Think and Speak English, this shift is the foundation of everything we do. We do not begin with how much English do you know. We begin with how are you using what you already have. Because the path forward is not about accumulation, it is about activation. Once English is treated as a living tool, the pressure changes. Mistakes lose their emotional weight. Simplicity becomes a strength, and progress becomes measurable not in test scores, but in real moments of expression. This is where the real journey begins, not with more studying, but with a different relationship to language, one built on trust instead of fear, on use instead of avoidance, on growth instead of perfection. And from this point forward, every episode in this series will build on that foundation. Step by step, we will dismantle the habits that keep English locked in your head and replace them with patterns that allow it to move naturally into your voice. Because when you change the way you think about English, you change the way you speak it. And that is exactly what Think and Speak English exists to help you do. Upgrade your mind, improve your English. As we come to the end of this episode, I want you to pause for a moment, not to judge your English, but to reflect on your experience with it. If you've spent years learning English and still feel unable to speak freely, there is nothing wrong with you. What you're experiencing is the result of a system that trained your mind for analysis, not expression. A system that rewarded silence more than courage and correctness more than connection. Once you see that clearly, something important changes. The frustration softens, the self-doubt loses its grip. You stop asking, why am I so bad at English, and start asking a better question. Why was I trained this way in the first place? That question is the beginning of progress. Because fluency is not a talent you are born with, and it is not a level you unlock after enough studying. It is a relationship you build with uncertainty, with imperfection, and with your own voice. And like any relationship, it improves through presence, not preparation. In the next episode, we will go deeper into one of the most common habits that silently blocks fluency around the world, the habit of memorizing vocabulary without knowing how to use it. We will explore why collecting words often creates the illusion of progress, and why fewer words used correctly can take you much further. If this episode helped you see your English in a new way, stay with us. This is Think and Speak English, where we don't just teach language, we help you upgrade your mind so you can improve your English. I'll see you in the next episode.